In a quiet neighborhood, where tree branches swayed gently in the cold breeze of the new year, one family began January 1st filled with joy, hope, and love. There were still leftovers from the New Year's Eve dinner sitting on the kitchen counter. The laughter of children still echoed through the rooms, and plans for the year ahead remained unfinished, resting quietly on a piece of paper that no one would ever complete. No one knew that morning would be their last. Just hours after midnight, when the old year gave way to the new, their home, once a place of warmth, would no longer be a home. It would become the scene of something unspeakably brutal. A fire broke out in the darkness. Smoke rolled in thick waves. The sound of a fire alarm tore through the peaceful silence of the neighborhood. And when firefighters kicked down the door, they didn't just walk into a house engulfed in flames. They walked into hell. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a moment of rage. Every detail, every trace, pointed to something far colder. Deliberate, calculated, step by chilling step. And the worst part? What happened behind that door didn't end quickly. It dragged on. It was vicious, and it spared no one, not even the youngest children. What pushes a person so far into darkness? What kind of mind could murder an entire family, then set fire to everything, as if none of it ever existed? And the most haunting question of all, on the very first morning of the new year, what truly walked through that front door? Richmond, Virginia. The first quiet hours of 2006 slipped by without incident. In the Woodland Heights neighborhood, the air still carried the warmth of New Year's Eve. Porch lights still glowed, the streets remained still, and inside each home, families lay fast asleep. No one could have known that just hours later, that calm would be shattered by smoke and by blood. That afternoon, a plume of smoke rose from a home on West 31st Street. At first, firefighters assumed it was nothing serious, maybe a kitchen fire or some harmless accident left over from the holiday celebrations. But the moment they stepped inside, they walked straight into a nightmare. Thick black smoke poured up from the basement, and down there, beneath the heat, the melted plastic, and layers of soot, lay 4 bodies. They didn't die from smoke inhalation. They were murdered, bound tightly with electrical cords and duct tape. The skin around their wrists and ankles was scorched, blistered from the intense heat. They'd been beaten with such brutal force that skulls were fractured. The weapon, later confirmed, be a claw hammer. And after all that ... one by one, their throats were slit. This wasn't just a murder. It was an execution. And the killer wasn't acting alone. He had a purpose, a plan, and not an ounce of humanity in what he did. This wasn't just violence, it was torture. Deliberate, prolonged, unimaginably cruel. The family inside that house weren't simply killed. They were hunted inside their own home, bound, beaten, and finally, slaughtered. When investigators found the bodies in the basement, the first thing they noticed was how close together the victims were lying. Not random, not rushed. Every sign pointed to one terrifying conclusion. They had likely been held captive for hours. Before the final, fatal blows were delivered. The killer didn't just murder. He stayed long enough to witness the pain, long enough to savor the silence that followed the slaughter. And then, as a final act of desecration, he set the fire. Not out of panic, but with cold intent. A calculated decision to erase everything, to burn it all to ash, and beneath that rising smoke were the names Richmond would never forget: Catherine, Brian, Stella, Ruby Harvey. They weren't celebrities, just neighbors, parents, artists, small business owners. They lived ordinary lives until they became the center of one of the most horrifying nightmares in the city's history. Catherine Harvey wasn't just a mother. She was a force of nature, creative, passionate, and deeply committed to her community. She co-founded a small toy store in the heart of Richmond, but it was more than just a shop. It was a childhood haven, a place where imagination thrived and where children found magic in every handcrafted piece. Her husband, Brian, was once a standout bass player in a college rock band. But as the years went by, he stepped away from the stage, away from the flashing lights, to follow a deeper, quieter rhythm: fatherhood. He was a calm, warm presence, with the soul of an artist and a gentle heart that everyone admired. Together, they had 2 daughters. Stella Ann was 9 years old, with eyes that lit up like headlights and a mind far beyond her years. She devoured books as if each page held a secret, and she asked questions like the world was a living encyclopedia waiting to be understood. Ruby, just 4, was the sunshine of the household, always smiling, the kind of grin that could brighten even the darkest day. Together, they were the heartbeat of their neighborhood. A little home filled with music, the laughter of children, and the purest kind of love. The kind that made you believe nothing bad could ever happen there. But something did, and it changed everything. The house was nothing but ashes and silence. What was once a warm, lived-in family home had been reduced to charred remains, its walls blackened, its windows blown out, its heartbeat extinguished. The deaths sent shockwaves, not only through friends and neighbors, but through strangers across the city. Even people who had never met the Harveys felt something deep and fundamental had been broken. At first came the grief, but quickly grief gave way to confusion, ... and confusion gave way to fear. There were no signs of forced entry, no threats, no known enemies, no warnings, just a family wiped off the face of the earth, brutally, methodically, like someone had planned it all down to the last breath. And deep down, investigators knew this wasn't random. It wasn't rage. It was a performance. Staged, controlled, calculated. Every detail told the same chilling story. Whoever did this didn't just want to kill. They wanted to leave a mark. The investigation was only the beginning, because what waited behind the door of that house wasn't chaos. It wasn't screaming. It started with something far more terrifying: silence. When Gray and Dandridge walked in, they weren't waving weapons like in some typical home invasion. They brought duct tape. They brought calm. They brought control. Every move was deliberate. No rush, no panic, not even a hint of urgency. Gray struck first. He led Catherine, Brian, and little Ruby down into the basement, one by one. Each of them was bound tightly with duct tape. No shouting, no chaos. Just a slow, silent domination, executed with the precision of someone who had rehearsed it in his mind 100 times before. And Dandridge? He wandered upstairs, like a predator stalking prey inside someone else's home, rummaging through drawers, opening the fridge, looking for food, money, anything he could take. The house, once filled with laughter and life, had turned into a hunting ground. Every corner, every shadow, now a place of ambush. Stella, just 9 years old, came home after a sleepover at a friend's. She didn't know, she couldn't have known, that waiting for her inside her own home was a nightmare no child should ever have to face. Catherine, the mother, was released, but only for a fleeting moment. Just long enough to walk to the doorstep of her daughter's friend's house and bring Stella home. Kirsten Parenson, the friend's mother, remembers it vividly. Catherine stood there, pale, silent, her eyes hollow. She didn't say a word, but something was wrong, deeply wrong. There was a weight behind her eyes, something strangled and broken inside the woman who once lit up every room she entered. Just minutes later, all of them, the entire Harvey family, were bound in the basement. 4 lives surrounded by 2 killers, inside the one place they should have been safest. There was no dramatic struggle, no heroic escape, just helplessness. The illusion of safety shattered, and their final moments began slipping away, second by second, in the hands of men who saw violence as power. What happened next wasn't frenzy. It wasn't chaos. It was ritual. Cold, calculated, cruel. Gray didn't rush, not once. He moved like someone who'd done this before. One by one, Catherine, Brian, Stella, and little Ruby had their throats slit, the duct tape still clinging to blistered skin. There was no panic, no mercy, just a cold, silent execution. But it didn't end there. Once their small, broken bodies fell quiet, Gray raised a claw hammer and began to swing. Not once, not just to be sure, but over and over, as if unleashing a fury on lifeless forms that couldn't fight back. Each blow followed the last, turning an already calculated murder into something far more brutal, vicious, and monstrous. When the medical examiner arrived, they did what they were trained to do: reduce unspeakable horror into clinical language. Brian and Catherine, cause of death, blunt force trauma to the head. Stella, smoke inhalation, combined with severe physical assault. Ruby, 4 years old, stabbed in the back, the wound piercing through to her lung. Words like that, they don't come close. They're data. They're terms. But they're not the truth of what that basement had witnessed. Not the terror. Not the silence. Not the slow, methodical unraveling of an entire family. And then, as if all of it wasn't enough, Gray and Dandridge decided to leave behind a final message. In the corner, a tiny easel. Maybe the same one Stella had once sat before, sketching her little world, was knocked over. They poured liquor over it and set it on fire. Not to destroy evidence, but to erase something deeper. Innocence, memory, and the soul of a home that once knew only love. It wasn't to hide the crime. Not exactly to destroy evidence either. It was to burn away the identity of that space. To turn a home once filled with music, art, and childhood into ash. A petty act, cruel in every detail. As the fire spread through the basement, wrapping itself around every last trace of the family that once lived there. From the outside, it looked like a heartbreaking accident. A devastating house fire on the first day of the new year. But that fire did not go unnoticed. Johnny, a longtime friend of Brian Harvey and the drummer for the band House of Freaks, was the first to notice the faint smoke curling through the quiet neighborhood. He walked over, determined to find out what was going on, and unknowingly became the one to open the door to the most horrifying nightmare of his life. When firefighters arrived, they thought they were responding to a routine house fire. But what they found inside ... ignited a storm far more devastating than the flames themselves. And while firefighters worked to put out the flames, two men, Ricky Gray and Ray Dandridge, had quietly slipped away from the house hours earlier, calm, unrushed, as if the lives of 4 innocent people were nothing more than ashes falling behind them. So who were they, Ricky Gray and Ray Dandridge? The answer isn't easy to hear, and it's even harder to forget. Born in 1977, the two were bound not just by blood, but by a dark legacy. A rotten childhood, steeped in violence and a long, grim trail of criminal behavior. Both lived on the fringes of society, where darkness wasn't just present, it was all they ever knew. For Ricky Gray, violence wasn't an anomaly, it was almost instinct. His criminal record was a long list of jail stints, broken relationships, and outbursts that flared like gunpowder. He wasn't just known for his explosive temper, but for his ability to turn anyone around him into a victim. And then he met Trevor Terrell, the woman who would become his third wife. Their relationship was far from peaceful, filled with constant arguments and violent altercations that neighbors often overheard. November 2005. After years of silently enduring abuse, Trevor Terrell, Ricky Gray's wife, had finally reached her breaking point. But she never got the chance to leave. Her body was discovered shortly afterward, brutally beaten and dumped in a shallow grave in Washington, Pennsylvania. A savage end for a woman who only wanted to escape. But here's the shocking part. Police initially ruled her death as a drug overdose. This despite the fresh scratch marks on Ricky's forearm. Clear signs of a struggle, possibly Treva's final attempt to fight for her life. But the police didn't connect the dots. They didn't see the killer standing right in front of them. Ray Dandridge, Ricky's nephew, freshly released after serving over a decade in prison for armed robbery, had moved in with Ricky and Treva just 1 month earlier. By the time Treva's body was found, Ray's true nature had already begun to surface. The anger, the cruelty, the violence that seemed to be etched into his very blood. So what happened next? There was no remorse, no attempt to run. After burying Treva, the two men simply kept moving, as if it were just another errand to check off a list. Ricky and Ray packed up their things. No rush, no effort to hide. They headed to Arlington, Virginia, hoping to lay low for a while. But the violence didn't stop. New Year's Eve, 2005. Virginia was still unfamiliar territory to Ricky Gray and Ray Dandridge, but violence wasn't. Just days after arriving, they struck again. Ryan was the first victim. Beaten and stabbed repeatedly, he was left outside his own home, as if no one would ever find him alive. But Ryan miraculously survived. He woke up in the hospital, his right arm permanently paralyzed. And as he began to recover, one memory came back with haunting clarity. The men who did it were Ricky Gray and Ray Dandridge. But that wasn't the darkest chapter. The true nightmare began on the very first day of the new year, January 1st, 2006. The Harvey family, Catherine, Brian, and their two young daughters, Stella and Ruby, were spending a quiet New Year's Day in their cozy Richmond home. No enemies, no warning. Just one unlocked door, and fate walked in. Gray would later confess they were simply looking for money. The house wasn't a planned target. They were just passing by and decided to take a chance. And when that door opened, an entire family was taken hostage, right inside the home they believed was their safest place on earth. Friends arrived at the house as scheduled, and no one noticed anything out of the ordinary. Catherine was forced to act like everything was fine, because she knew if she slipped, if she said a single wrong word, everyone she loved would die. She stayed calm. She tried to protect her children. But once the door closed behind those unsuspecting friends, the nightmare truly began. The entire family was bound, tortured, and murdered. And it didn't end there. Gray and Dandridge set the house on fire, attempting to erase the evidence. But the flames couldn't hide the horror. Days later, their own accomplice, Ashley Baskerville, became the next victim. Along with her mother, Mary Baskerville Tucker, and her stepfather, Percival Tucker, she was brutally murdered in what can only be described as a cold-blooded purge. It marked the chilling end of one of the darkest chapters of family-driven crime in modern American history. It all started with what looked like an ordinary robbery. On January 3, 2006, in Chesterfield County, Virginia, a couple living on Hollywood Drive opened their door to three strangers, two men and a woman, who claimed they were lost and needed directions. They seemed friendly, harmless, trustworthy, but it was all a facade. The moment the door opened, the nightmare began. The trio forced their way in, overpowered the couple, and stole a computer, a television, and $800 in cash. The husband pleaded with them, pointing out his wife's disability, saying she needed special care. They hesitated, just for a moment. But by then, it was already too late. They didn't realize that this crime would become the final link in a deadly chain. Just a few days later, on January 6th, Chesterfield police received a troubling phone call from a concerned citizen. Ashley Baskerville, a young woman with suspicious ties to two men, Ricky Gray and Ray Dandridge, had been acting strangely. Both men had recently stayed at her home as guests, and both were now wanted in connection with the brutal murders of the Harvey family. That phone call was a flash of light cutting through the fog. Following the tip, police quickly tracked down and surrounded the house on East Broad Street, where Ashley lived with her mother and stepfather. But they were too late. Inside, all three, Ashley, her mother, and her stepfather, were already dead. It was the final act in the bloody rampage of two remorseless killers. When police stepped into the house on East Broad Street, they weren't just entering a crime scene. They were walking straight into a living nightmare, where brutality lingered in every corner, every bloodstain, every trace of a final breath left behind. The house was in shambles, clear signs that violence had taken over. Priscilla and Mary Tucker, Ashley's stepfather and mother, had their throats savagely slashed. There was no chance to fight back, no last words. Their lives were taken so quickly, death was likely the first and only thing they had time to feel. But the most horrifying discovery was what had been done to Ashley. She hadn't just been killed. She'd been executed in the coldest, most calculated way imaginable. A plastic bag had been wrapped tightly around her head, sealed with duct tape. That same tape bound her hands and feet, sealed her mouth, and kept all three victims trapped in a state of absolute helplessness. Three people inside their own home, forced to die in silence, as if their deaths were meant to be a statement of dominance and total control. While processing the scene, police found a computer and a TV, both matching perfectly with the items reported stolen during the Chesterfield home invasion just days earlier. But it was one small detail that turned suspicion into certainty: the ring on Ashley's finger. It didn't belong to her. It was Catherine Harvey's wedding ring, the mother from the family brutally murdered in Richmond on New Year's Day. Morning of January 7th, 2006, the end had finally arrived. Ricky Gray and Ray Dandridge were arrested in Philadelphia, found hiding out in the home of Dandridge's father. After days on the run and a trail of unimaginable violence, the murderous duo were finally in handcuffs. Just 1 hour after their arrest, Ray Dandridge cracked, whether from guilt or the overwhelming weight of the evidence against him. He confessed to taking part in the murders of Priscilla and Mary Tucker, along with their daughter, Ashley Baskerville. But that was just the tip of the iceberg. 12 hours later, in a separate holding cell, Ricky Gray, silent since his arrest, asked to speak with a detective. What happened next chilled everyone in the room. Gray didn't deny. He didn't dodge. Instead, he handed over a 3-page confession, meticulously detailing how he murdered the entire Harvey family using a kitchen knife and a claw hammer. Every blow, every movement cold, calculated, deliberate. He didn't make excuses. He didn't blame his past. He didn't claim madness or a moment of rage. Just one sentence. I don't think sorry is strong enough. But Gray wasn't done. He went on to confess to killing his wife, Treva, whose body had been discovered in a shallow grave in Pennsylvania. According to him, Dandridge held her down while he carried out the murder. Dandridge, he admitted, also played a role in the killing of the Baskerville Tucker family. And as if that wasn't enough, Gray also confessed to the brutal assault of Ryan Carey, a man who barely survived one of the first attacks in their violent spree. As the investigation unfolded, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. By January 8, 2006, police had confirmed a shocking truth. Ashley Baskerville, the young woman once believed to be a victim, was, in fact, part of the crime. She wasn't an innocent caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. She was actively involved in the robberies, and possibly even the murders. Eyewitness accounts and physical evidence recovered during the search all pointed to one chilling conclusion. Ashley played a specific willing role in the horror. She had acted as a lookout while Ricky Gray and Ray Dandridge broke into the Harvey home. She faked being a hostage, allowing herself to be tied up as part of a plan to trick her own parents during the setup for a robbery. But there was one thing Ashley hadn't accounted for. There's no loyalty among killers. Gray decided she was no longer useful, so he killed her coldly, without hesitation. Then he and Dandridge took off in her parents' car, leaving nothing behind but bodies and betrayal. In their confessions, Gray and Dandridge didn't hold back. They admitted to their deep involvement in the string of killings, from the Harvey family to Trevor to the Tuckers. Their arrest didn't just end a manhunt, it sent shockwaves through the community. So many lives shattered, families torn apart, and countless questions that may never be answered. Not just who did it, but how people can become so vicious, so inhuman. The trial of Ricky Gray and Ray Dandridge was just as intense and haunting as the crimes they committed. Two men, two shadows of cruelty walked into the Richmond City Courthouse, a place where justice was demanded, and silence was no longer an option. On February 9, 2006, the law began to shape the narrative of this horrifying case. Ricky Gray was charged with 5 counts of first-degree murder, each stacked with aggravating circumstances. Multiple murders committed within a 3-year span. Multiple victims killed in a single event. Murder committed during the commission of a robbery. And most disturbingly, the murder of 2 children under the age of 14. Each charge was a strike against humanity and a clear justification for the harshest sentence the law could deliver. Meanwhile, Ray Dandridge was charged with 3 counts of capital murder in connection to the deaths of Mary, Priscilla, and Ashley Baskerville. Under mounting pressure, and perhaps as a final act of self-preservation, he changed his plea just before the trial concluded. He admitted to all 3 murders and accepted a plea deal. Life in prison without the possibility of parole, a move that spared him from the death penalty. Ricky Gray pleaded not guilty. Even with dried blood and overwhelming evidence stacked against him, he stood in court and claimed innocence. His defense team painted a bleak picture of his past, a childhood scarred by physical and sexual abuse, and argued that on the day of the murders, Gray was under the influence of PCP, a powerful hallucinogenic drug. They hoped this would stir sympathy, that maybe the jury would waver, but it didn't. After just 4 days of testimony and only 30 minutes of deliberation, the jury delivered their verdict. Ricky Gray was guilty on all 5 counts of first-degree murder, and they didn't hesitate to recommend the death penalty, especially for the brutal killings of Stella and Ruby Harvey, 2 innocent young children. On October 23, 2006, Ricky Gray was officially sentenced to death, but the story didn't end there. In December of that same year, he was charged once again, this time for the murder of Cheryl Warner, a 37-year-old mother of 3. She had been found shot and hanged in the basement of a burning house in Culpeper County, a scene as chilling as it was familiar. The fire, the pain, the complete control. All of it carried Gray's signature. However, in 2008, the charges were dropped due to a lack of solid evidence and inconsistencies in witness statements. Still, Gray's shadow loomed large. He wasn't just a killer. He became a lingering nightmare for both the justice system and the community. From 2011 to 2015, his execution was delayed multiple times. Appeals were filed at the state level, then the federal level. Each hearing, each sheet of paper bought him more time, but could never undo what had been done. In November 2015, the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals denied Gray's request. By January of the following year, his execution was scheduled March 16, 2016, but Gray wasn't ready to die. His attorneys filed a final appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court, a last-ditch effort to save his life. The court declined to hear the case. There were no more options left. In 2016, after every appeal had been exhausted, Virginia Governor Terry McAuliffe officially denied Ricky Gray's request for clemency. On January 18, 2017, at around 10 p.m., Ricky Gray was executed by lethal injection at the Greensville Correctional Center. More than a decade after the massacre, justice had finally been carried out. As for Ray Dandridge, the accomplice who pled guilty to avoid the death penalty, he remains in prison, serving a life sentence without the possibility of parole. He will spend the rest of his life behind bars, haunted by the dark legacy of what he helped unleash. The story didn't end in the courtroom. It still lingers quiet and heavy in the memories of Richmond's people. A place that was once home, a community, a symbol of hope. Until two men carrying darkness crossed its threshold. Gray paid with his life. Dandridge is paying with the rest of his. But the pain they left behind, that still remains. Even after the verdict was read, even as the spotlight dimmed on two cold-blooded killers, one question continues to echo in the minds of those left behind. Was that truly the end? Or somewhere out there, is there still a secret buried? Something lurking in the shadows, waiting to rise again? What about you? What do you believe really happened inside that house? Have all the pieces truly been put together? Share your thoughts in the comments below. The story may be over, but sometimes the truth is only just beginning.